And again, I speak humbly. I'm not an expert, but I am interested in this period in local history, so it was a pleasure to take this assignment. I am going to use notes. Forgive me for that, but I just didn't want to forget anything. And I want to start out by saying that I think it's important to remember when you visit a site like Warriesville. And yesterday there was a whole conversation about the doctrine of discovery and getting too political, not political from the church's point of view. I think it's really important to remember that there's a geopolitical framework that must be understood, really, in order to understand the events which inspired the formation of this shrine. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Both the government of France and during the time of Isaac Jogues, the government of the Netherlands, eventually it would be England, were hell-bent on establishing Nouvelle France in the New World and New Netherlands to the south. And each desired ascendancy and control over the land and the resources and the people who lived here. And again, even though the doctrine of discovery was, we had agreed theoretically that it was not moral, it was still operative. It was very convenient to call the people who lived here heathen, less than, savage, and does not see beyond the cultural differences. And because then you could take their land and take their resources much more easily. So that was still operative in this battle between the forces of Europe trying to gain control and ascendancy over this land and its resources. The French turned to the Hurons. The native peoples who lived were Iroquois speaking, but they were a different tribal group historically than the people who lived in New York State. And they surrounded Quebec, Montreal, and so they turned to the Hurons, and they tried to, again, create relationship with the Hurons as much as they could, and to use them for the fur trade. The Dutch, and after the English, turned to the Iroquois Confederacy, which was, at the time that they came here, that they were battling here for resources, made up of, and some of this may be so old hat, but just to be sure, 5 tribes: the Mohawks who lived here, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And using the metaphor of the longhouse that you guys were looking at yesterday, you see them marked out, the structural, familial buildings that people lived in. Using that metaphor, the Haudenosaunee, the 5 tribes who had joined in Confederacy in order to stop fighting with each other and to find some way to live peaceably, they created this confederacy with all kinds of rules and regulations. They used the metaphor of the longhouse. So the Mohawks were at the most eastern door, the Senecas the most western door, the Onondagas in the middle kept the fire, they kept burning to keep the Confederacy alive. So we're standing at the eastern door of the longhouse. Both France and at that point the Netherlands used the indigenous people to supply furs for the fur trade, which they saw as this incredible bonus of coming here and trying to, and expending the resources they were expending in order to create Nouvelle France in New Netherlands. And they both saw the Indians as the key, the Indians who surrounded, who they were in their vicinity, to the wealth which they wanted to attain. And so both national governments had to be constantly convinced to expend the money to keep this enterprise going and to establish this foothold. And so, gaining ascendancy in the fur trade would be the key to keeping this whole enterprise going. And so because of that, the respective rulers of France and the Netherlands fueled rumors and fueled intertribal hatreds and animosities that existed from historical conflict. They fueled them. They used the native people against each other. Right. To in order to try to gain that ascendancy that they wanted. And so a lot of the story that surrounds what happened to Isaac Jogues and the other martyrs is set right in the middle of that, using these people as a key to gaining wealth. what was happening was what is called historically the Beaver Wars, over who was going to gain control of the fur trade. And it was into this incipient and brutal beaver wars being fed by the colonial powers that Isaac Jogues and his fellows stepped into the 1630s and 40s. The government of France was very happy to have partnership with especially the Jesuits, who were very eager to bring the message of Christ to new peoples. And so they were very happy to have that partnership because it was kind of a way of cementing community and the national interests of France and the land here. So it's into the framework of war and the mayhem and the cultural confusion that the native people were experiencing as they were being used as pawns in these great colonial games for power and ascendancy. And you know, the confusion that comes from this incredible cultural collision. That helps to explain what happened to the Jesuits both here and in Canada. Unwittingly, though deeply committed, and they were, when you read their writings, they wrote constantly about their experiences and something called the Jesuit relations. It was like the thing to get your hands on when you were in France, because they were sending letters home about this incredible experience they were having in this incredibly new environment. And so there's so much written that, you know, where you can really detail, but unwittingly, these deeply committed men bringing the message of Jesus sincerely and the comforts of Christianity to the native people of the New World, unwittingly they became tools of empire building and victims also of the vicious conflicts, growing fears, and uncertainties and instabilities of the moment. I think it's really important to have that context in a place like this. I know as children coming here was the savage, heathen, you know, hate-filled population that was, you know, attacking these innocent men, but in truth, there was turmoil that explained so much of the violence that ultimately ensued. St. Isaac Jogues arrived in New France in 1636. He joined Jean de Brebeuf, who had established a community among the Hurons, and that was his original mission, to work with the Hurons, because the French were comfortable with that, and that was, you know, in their territory, and they, you know, they were trying to use them as, you know, as a way of coming into this territory and gaining ascendancy. So they were in mission in Ontario. Isaac Jogues spent 6 years in Ontario on these missions with the Hurons. He learned the languages. He learned to embrace the native peoples, to do, as Jean de Brebeuf said, to teach them and to procure them their soul's health. But it was done with this great understanding that it was important to speak with respect to the culture and to come to understand the culture and to try to explain the message of Jesus that they wanted to bring in terms that the native people would understand in terms of their own very deep spirituality. So during this time he helped to establish there's still a museum there, a new mission at St. Maria de Huron. So he had this long history of involvement before he ended up here. In 1642, Jogues, René Goupil, and Guillaume Couture, and I'm just going to mention this because I suspect we're all in the same boat historically. I've come to realize I have another tie to this place. Guillaume Couture was, in my father's genealogy, some distant relative, a Canadian, and ultimately he was what's called a Donné. René Goupil, also a Donné. They were lay brothers of the Jesuits, and also committed to the mission. And so, they, along with some Christian Hurons, were waylaid by an Iroquois war party, again, who's out to look for the Hurons coming into their territory to steal their fur and to steal their power. And so they were, again, caught up in these Beaver Wars enterprise. So it wasn't that they were targeted because they were Christian, it was targeted because they were representative of this foreign government. They were taken captive, and they were brought south through a series of Mohawk villages. So there were a number of villages along the way here, not far distant, but a few miles, you know, north. And ultimately, in each village, they were greeted with the violence that often accompanied people who were seen as invasive into the villages. They were tortured, they were beaten, and ultimately came to Asr. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it correctly. Asr Anan, where we are, or theoretically where we are. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they were taken captive. They were brought out, and they ended up being held captive. Essentially, the decisions were made about not to kill them. The Dutch were very worried about problems with the French, and they didn't want to see these people killed. So they actually, they had good relationships with the Iroquois, they begged for that they would not be killed, that they would be held captive, as often was the case, often to replace dead members of the tribe. Apparently Isaac Jogues was actually taken in by a kind woman who had some power in her longhouse, kind of a semi-slave state in the sense of, you'll work, but we'll take care of you. And so he lived here for 13 months in that kind of state, with the Dutch kind of keeping the ear to the ground to make sure that he was still alive. René Goupil was also here, and in a similar state. Now, Isaac Jogues reports they were always hungry, they were cold. The bottom line was it was a period of time that was hard for the native people too, so they probably were sharing that cold hunger with the people he lived with. His aunt adopted him. During this time, René Goupil ended up being subject to the wrath of a man who was anti-French, a native person living in the village. And so there were differences of political opinion among the people who lived in these villages. So he was seen by the spies or someone who told this man, making the sign of the cross on the forehead of this man's grandson. And that so infuriated this apparently guy with some kind of power in the community that he conspired with probably the violent elements, the young bucks in the community, and they tomahawked René Goupil, and as when you go through the ravine here. And Isaac Jogues reported it. We're saying the rosary, we're walking together, and Jogues was sensing that there was, and he wrote about this, so that's why we know it. He was sensing that there were elements conspiring against them in the community that maybe weren't going to be strong enough to save them. And so he was warning him. He said that in their prayer, he was telling him he should always be prepared for death. He was tomahawked. His body was dragged through the village by children who kind of run rogue, and he was thrown into the ravine that you'll walk through. Isaac Jogues was prevented from following. Ultimately, his body was affected. Animals tore apart the body, and Isaac Jogues eventually was able to go to the ravine and try to bury the remains as best he could. In the following spring, he came back with the thought of being much more formal about that, and he found some bones. Some of the people in the village who understood his sadness and his need helped him find the bones that were there, and he reports burying them as best he could in the ravine, and therefore people call the ravine here that you'll be walking through a reliquary, that in a sense that you're not visiting a physical reliquary, you're walking within one. So the Dutch became particularly worried that Isaac Jogues would also end up with the same fate. So they convinced the leadership in the village to let Isaac Jogues join a party that was going to Albany with furs and for some kind of negotiation. And they did, and their plans had been made. He was spirited away. He ended up being sent back to France. Well, apparently the passion that drove him, he couldn't let go. Even though his hands had been mutilated by torture, he had to get special dispensation to say the Mass because of regulations that guided how he needed to hold the host and so forth. And he did. And then he came back as fast as he could, and for a short period of time, he was in Quebec City, but he wanted to get back here to this place that he had created a great connection to. And so in the spring of '46, he was back in Iroquois territory. He was tasked by the French government with being an ambassador to the Mohawks. I mean, his language, his experience just made him the best ambassador. This time his companion was Jean de Lalande, another lay brother, Donné. And they came back. Unwittingly, though, the period he was gone, there was a great increase in death because of smallpox and measles among the people. Again, because of their exposure without any immune defense. And and also he had left behind, kind of as a promise that he was coming back, a black box that contained vestments, things for mass. And so there was always suspicion among elements in the community that these black robes were in fact shamans and possessed black magic. And because there had been a blight also that had affected the crops, and there had been so much death, elements again within the community, especially the anti-French elements, said it's their fault. There they come back again, and they have caused this. And so there was council decision within the village about whether or not to kill or eliminate Isaac Jogues and Jean Lalande. And the agreement, for the most part, was no, to let them live, except that there was the Bear clan element in the community, which was particularly anti-French, took it upon themselves to essentially waylay them, tomahawk them, behead them, throw their body into the Mohawk River, put their heads on pike at the front of the village, and as a message to the French, stop meddling with us. And so that's how they he met his demise. So that is essentially the geopolitical framework and the impact that it had on these very sincere missionaries. There's an interesting controversy that's going on. Let me just talk about the shrine first. So in the 1880s, there was a Jesuit in Troy, New York, who basically had grown up with this great devotion to the story of the martyrs in the New World. And so he ultimately, let me just make sure I've got the dates right, he determined that he wanted to know exactly where the village was, where Isaac Jogues and Jean Lalande and René Goupil had been killed. So he consulted, he did this very scientifically. He consulted, there was a Civil War general who was retired from this area, who just spent all his free time studying this. He wasn't Catholic, but he wanted to decide where all the Mohawk chapels and churches were that the Jesuits had established. So he was on a mission to do this archaeological research, and he did a lot of writing. There was another guy by the name of Shea, who was an amateur archaeologist. So this priest, his name was Father Joseph Lesans, consulted them and spent a lot of time trying to be very scientific in determining where the village was, and ultimately determined it was here based on their research, based on the Jesuit relations, Isaac Jogues' description of the land and the topography. And so in 1884, and this to me, I think we need to stop and picture this. Troy is what, John? How many miles from here?
50.
All right, 50 miles from here. This is 1884. He created a pilgrimage in 1884 that saw 4,000 people come from Troy and Albany. I'm assuming they came by train. I haven't been able to find the detail. I don't know if any of them walked, but the first pilgrimage here was 4,000 people. And then every year after that, and he personally bought the land, and it might even be this parcel, a small parcel, and ultimately people began to come regularly and in large numbers. And so they ultimately bought all of the land that the shrine is on. And so the effort to find out exactly where this was really sincere. The problem is that in the descriptions of the villages, the Europeans were trying to translate names that were Mohican. And often the translations were rough. Villages moved often. Probably talked about that yesterday with the longhouses. There was a certain built-in obsolescence. They had to constantly move to locations. The description of topography was kind of, again, catch as catch can. In 1666, another connection to my relatives that reminds me how I'm so caught up with history, and as we all are, de Tracy, who was a French general, was sent because the Mohawks were starting to get restive about the presence of the Jesuits in their midst again, because there was a trial, actually. The man who killed Isaac Jones was put on trial. He was held accountable for it because it kind of went against the community. He was baptized before his execution, and they named him Isaac Jones. Oh. And I think that's kind of an interesting story. But because the natives started to become restive, the French sent this expedition led by this General de Tracy, some distant relative again of my father was part of this army. They came and laid waste to all the villages. They burned them to the ground, all the Mohawk villages in the area. So all of that accounted for the fact that there was uncertainty about where things were located. But the priest who started the shrine had done due diligence in order to be sure that he was correct. However, recent archaeology, recent in the sense of probably the 70s, 80s, Dean Snow is a famous Native American archaeologist who was at SUNY Albany for quite a long time, and a man by the name of Richard Smith, who's writing a book. He sent me a draft of it called The True Locations of the Death of the Jesuit Martyrs and of the Birth of St. Catherine Tekakwitha. Their studies indicate that probably the village was 9 miles west of here. Obviously, a shrine has existed since 1880s, built in profound sincerity, and also totally filling this space with the energies of people who want to live within the sacred and want to understand, the motivations that would drive people from France to come here and face all the privations they did in order to bring the word of Christ to a new people. So I think that's kind of, I don't think it takes away from the sacredness of this location and the story, but it's kind of interesting. So the story goes on. So thank you very much.